Liebe Kollegen, ich verstehe, dass das die Menge an Informationen, die man hier im Saal bekommt und die dann in der Industrieausstellung auch nochmal auf uns wartet, ist natürlich immens und eigentlich haben wir gar nicht so viel Zeit, um das alles zu verarbeiten. Aber ich kann nicht ernsthafterweise dem Referenten aufs Gaspedal drücken und sagen, er muss jetzt dringend seinen Vortrag in der Zeit beenden, wenn wir das nicht auch tun. I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Olsson, and introduce you. Mr. Olsson is from Sweden, and therefore he's going to talk in English to us. And I'm looking forward to hear something about conscious breathing and CO2 treatment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi. Everyone who's breathing, please raise your hand. No, I'm kidding.
I stopped.
You stopped, okay. So I'm going to talk about conscious breathing and CO2 therapy, the what, why, and how. And let's start with the history first of CO2 therapy. This is really not something new. It dates all the way back to the Greeks and the Romans. Here is an example, the Baths of Caracalla in Rome. It was a very big building. It could accommodate up to 6,000 people in a day, 3,000 people at the same time. So you imagine a huge complex. And at the height of the Roman bathing culture, they consumed 10 times as much water as we consume on average in Sweden today. And a lot of this water, they came from hot springs or mineral springs. And it turns out that a lot of them have high levels of carbon dioxide. So the Romans used it for relaxation, for skin conditions, or when they were out fighting, coming back and had wounds and injured, they could improve and fasten their healing. And here is an example from 1794. This is from a city in England, Bath. And Dr. Ewart, he created this device to treat...
Can you put it back?
Okay. Did I do something? He created this device to treat ulcerated breast cancer, meaning open wounds. And he said, without exception, every single time we applied CO2, the pain went away. And one of the people, one of the women in the, he talks about in his book, she had a wound that was around 10 times 13 centimeters, huge wound. She had such a pain, she was screaming up to 2 hours per day just because of that pain. When the CO2 was applied, the pain went away every time. This is from a book published more than 100 years ago, Carbon Dioxide in Medicine. We have republished it. It's available on Amazon. And in the book, he discusses the history of CO2 therapy. And they had very positive effect in all kinds of problems like whooping cough, asthma, anemia, PMS, impotence, difficult labor, digestion problems, circulation problems. And here are a couple of images from the book. This is from 1895. So they have water in here that is enriched with CO2. And the blankets is to prevent the CO2s from escaping up in the air. Another picture here from the book where they inhale CO2 and also where they give rectally. Somehow this has been forgotten, and there are though places where it's still used. Here is an example. We're going there next week, actually. Mariánské Lázně in Czech Republic, the city of 100 springs. In the city core, they have 40 springs. Many of them have high levels of CO2, and they give these mineral baths high, in CO2. They give CO2 injections. You can have dry CO2 baths in this place. So we're looking forward to go there and experience their offering. This is from Romania and Turia, where they call them Mofetta CO2 caves. You go into the cave, you have your clothes on, and there is up to 96% CO2. Of course, you cannot inhale that, so the CO2, it only goes up to the belly. And the nickname for these Mofettas is natural Viagra, because people notice that something happens with the circulation, they improve their parasympathetic response, and they get more sexually stimulated, because that's a state we need to be in order to be sexually aroused, more in a parasympathetic state, and we need to have circulation. So CO2 has many interesting effects. And as you see, they have their clothes on, meaning that the CO2 can go through fabric. It's easily permeates fabric. So conscious breathing and CO2 therapy, our definition of that is raising carbon dioxide and reducing oxygen. So let me share why we think that is important. So when we inhale the atmosphere at sea level, 21% oxygen, but the thing is, we only use a little bit. We exhale 3/4 of what we just inhaled. We only use about 25%. The rest is exhaled. So when someone asks you to take a big breath to oxygenate your body better, that is not the case. It's the same as with your car. It doesn't go better just because we decide to give it more fuel. The car needs the right amount of fuel. The same with our body. And when it comes to carbon dioxide, the atmosphere contains very little CO2, 0.04%. And we are all carbon dioxide factories. We manufacture CO2, so we exhale about 100 times more than we inhale. And a lot of us, we end up like this. We have too much oxygen and too little CO2. And typically that occurs when we are stressed, when we are anxious, afraid, when we are inactive, when we eat junk food. All of this will upset the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. And from a breathing perspective, when we are overbreathing, it's typically fast, shallow, big, through the mouth, it's unrhythmic. And a lot of us, we do like that. This is the description of the modern man. We are a bit stressed, anxious, we are inactive, we are turning to junk food to keep our energy up. And that has a big impact on our health from this breathing and CO2 and oxygen perspective. So why is CO2 so important? Many of us, we have heard about oxygen is the hero, CO2 is the villain. Give me more oxygen and exhale the poisonous CO2. It's just a waste product. Just get it out of our system as soon as possible. But that is not true, not at all. It's all about balance, including the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. So what happens when we lower the levels of CO2 is that we actually put restriction and friction in our body. The airways, when we have cramps in our airways, we call it bronchospasm, and we may be diagnosed with asthma. That's when the airways live in an environment that is low in CO2. The response from the smooth muscles is to constrict and going into spasm. When we have cramping of the blood vessels, we call it angina pectoris. It's the smooth muscles surrounding the blood vessels. So we know we have 3 types of muscles, right? The heart muscle, the skeletal muscle that we can control by will, and then we have the smooth muscles. And they surround not only the airways and blood vessels, but also the stomach and intestines. So when we have cramp in the stomach, we have stomach pain, that's when the intestines live in an environment that is low in CO2. Of course, for all of these, there are more contributing factors. I'm not saying that CO2 low levels is the only, but it's highly, highly associated with these issues, low CO2 and these issues we see here. When a woman having PMS issues or difficult labor, that coincides with lower levels of CO2. And also we may experience more aches and pains in our muscles and joints when there are low levels of CO2. And one example of how CO2 makes the blood vessels open up and freeing up the flow of blood is that when a surgeon is performing brain surgery, they're using the opposite mechanism, putting the patient in slight hyperventilation to reduce the CO2, which constrict the blood vessels, so there is less blood flow coming to the brain, which is an advantage for the surgeon who wants to have room for the surgical instruments to perform the surgery. And there will also be less of messy bleeding. That may be an advantage in a surgical setting, having a smaller brain, but I guess no one of us want that in our daily life. That's why we can see, if we do like this, we become stupid. If you see a Hollywood movie and you have an actor that should act as someone who is not so smart, what they usually do is open the mouth. When we open the mouth, we lose more CO2. We constrict blood vessels. We have less blood flow to the brain. This book came out in 1952. Dr. Frances Amos from South Africa, the first female doctor in South Africa. She got the Star of Africa from Nelson Mandela. The hyperventilation syndrome, she noticed, she studied 40 patients and had them hyperventilating. And in all cases except one, their health issues came back. They had all kinds of issues like epilepsy, tinnitus, dizziness, racing heart, etc. And the case that it didn't work for, that person had to abort the study because the problems came back so quickly, so she couldn't follow through and do the whole protocol. So basically in all of the patients, the health issues came back when too much oxygen and too little CO2. So let's move on to the next side of the coin then. We talked about the negative effects of reducing CO2 and then the negative effects of having too much oxygen. So we call it oxidative stress when we have too much oxygen. In our mitochondria, where we produce most of our energy, that is also the source for producing most of our free radicals. So if we have more CO2, we may increase the production. If we have more oxygen, we may increase the inflammations. If we take an example, we take a bite in an apple or an avocado and we put it down, what happens after some time? It will start to turn brown, right? And that's because it's exposed to oxygen. That's why we protect food from oxygen. We put it in plastics, and the same biological process that happens in the apple also happens in our body. Makes sense, right? In this study, they took mice and put them in a low oxygen environment, and the response from the mice was that they lived 50% longer than normal. And it was not that they were just like this, had no energy. On the opposite, when they did different tests on them, they had actually increased neurological function. So not only did they live a lot longer, they were also being able to perform better. The same research group later did another study on mice and noticed that it had a positive effect on Parkinson, even to the point where it started to improve, not only stopping the the increase of Parkinson, but also reducing the symptoms. There are some studies showing that high altitude is beneficial for health. In this study, fewer heart attacks and longer life. They studied 1,200 men and women for 15 years, and they compared them. So one group 950 meters, and the control group at sea level. And they noticed that the men had 61% fewer heart attacks, the women 54% fewer. Here is a study from Switzerland where they took 10 years of mortality data, 1.64 million included in the study, and they lived from 260 meters to 1900, and they found an almost linear decrease. So as they went up to higher altitude, the heart disease and stroke went down. Again, of course, there could be many contributing factors, but at high altitude we know that the oxygen levels are lower. So it could indicate, right, that oxygen reduction plays a part in this positive results. Here is another study. Lung cancer decreases with elevation, and the authors of the study goes as far as to conclude that there is evidence for oxygen as being an inhaled carcinogen. That is a bold statement, yeah? So they noticed that elevation is strongly negatively associated with lung cancer incidence. And again, they say that the findings suggest that oxygen is an inhaled carcinogen, inherently and inversely tied to elevation. It's a thorough study. I recommend you read it if you're interested. And it only had an effect on the lung cancer, not an effect on other types of cancers. But they also conclude if the entire United States were living at an altitude of 3,500 meters, it will reduce the lung cancer cases with 65,000 per year. Anyway, I'm trying to plant a seed here, trying to think out of the box where we have a tendency to put oxygen up here and CO2 up here. Maybe we should try to think twice and not only see oxygen as a saver. We know, of course, that we need oxygen. If we stop breathing, we die within minutes. Oxygen is crucial. If we deprive our body of oxygen, we need to produce energy without oxygen, and we will only survive for a few minutes. That's why we need oxygen so badly, to produce energy efficiently. But again, it's about the balance. So if we look at exercise, there are actually quite a few exercise concepts that helps us to change the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. So one reason why probably people like to exercise is that we increase the production of CO2. It can increase up to 6-fold when we do physical activity, which then means we reduce friction and restriction. It's basically like removing the foot from the brake in our car. So the air can flow more easily, the blood can flow more easily, the lymphatic flow can flow more easily. So when we do high altitude training, that's popular amongst athletes. You reduce the oxygen, as we already talked about. You do not increase CO2 at high altitude, but you improve the ratio between oxygen and carbon dioxide. If you're familiar with high-intensity interval training, it's very popular amongst many people who exercise. There, you're not able to oxygenate your body. You're not able to maintain that breathing that the muscles need. And also, you're not able to exhale all the CO2 that is produced when you do high-intense training. So it's basically a form of training where you reduce oxygen and increase CO2. Another concept comes from Japan. It's called katsu. It's a blood flow restriction training. So if I want to train this muscle, I will then put something over it here to restrict the blood flow. And what happens with this muscle is that it will grow stronger in a faster period of time than if I'm just training the muscle without the blood flow restriction. So when I restrict blood flow, I restrict incoming oxygen, and I restrict the CO2 from escaping from the muscle, right? So again, it's training the muscle in a low oxygen environment and high CO2. Breath holds during exercise is also starting to become more popular. Nasal breathing during exercise. I think I was the first person in the world who ran a half marathon with, I had duct tape like this whole way over my mouth, just to show that it's possible. That was 13 years ago. At the time, not that many people, athletes, were into nasal breathing. Today, it's quite spread, actually. Or you can do intermittent hypoxic training. You expose yourself at sea level to lower levels of oxygen to improve your athletic performance. Here is a really interesting study. They took a bunch of rugby players, elite rugby players, and they did sprint training. During 4 weeks, they did 7 sprint trainings, and they did it during low oxygen and high CO2. They were basically holding their breath. So let's say they were supposed to run from here to the wall there, and they had a certain amount of seconds to do that. And if they didn't reach that, they were out. So before they managed to do 9 of these sprints, after 4 weeks with breath holding, they were able to do almost 15, so an increase by 64%. And of course, they had a control group, and they only improved by 6%. So we can then understand how lowering oxygen, increasing CO2 makes the body become a lot more efficient, just like a car with high gas mileage. If you have poor gas mileage, you need to fill up the car with fuel all the time, right? You can run very little. If you have high gas mileage, you fill it up and you can go on forever, kind of. So that's if we have an oxygen-efficient body. We will spend less of our resources in fight, flight, and survival, and there will be more room to do whatever we want to do, if that is put a smile on our face or make wise food decisions or whatever it is. Okay, so let's look at animals, and I think it's fascinating to look at animals and see, have they figured out something that we haven't? So what do these animals have in common? Well, they all live in environments that are low in oxygen and high in CO2. The ant queen, naked mole rat, termite queen, echidna, and tuatara, they live in burrows underground. So they are forced to inhale some of the air they just exhale. So they also produce CO2. So they are naturally inhaling more CO2. An ant queen, it could typically be 5% CO2 in their nest, which is 150 times more, 120 times more than in normal atmosphere. And the bat lives in caves, and typically in the caves there is also 5% CO2 because their urine, when they pee, is very acidic, which will make the stalagmites, I think, to release CO2. So all of them live in very high levels of CO2 and low levels of oxygen. And they have a long life. So let's look at one of the creatures, the naked mole rat. Really pretty. It has some remarkable health features. It lives for up to 30 years, and its nearest cousin is the normal rat, which only lives 2 to 3 years. It has no oxidative stress, no osteoporosis. It can become pregnant even at 29 years old. It doesn't feel pain even if it's being burnt with acid. Some of these studies are, of course, very stupid and cruel, but that's what I've tested. Even when they inject cancer cells, they do not develop cancer. Only study have showed developing cancer once, and that was when they were brought out of their natural environment and into living in atmospheric air. So the level they live in is, the oxygen is like the top of Mount Everest, only 7%, and the CO2 levels are about 150 times more than we normally inhale. But even worse are these guys living in the oceans, in the water. And if we think about the composition of water, of CO2 and oxygen, at the surface there is about 25 times less oxygen than in the atmosphere. Many of these, they live maybe at 300, 400, 800,000 meters depth, where the oxygen is even less, about 50 times less than in the atmosphere. And for CO2, it's the opposite, 50, 60 times more CO2 in the water. Kind of interesting. When the dinosaurs were around, what the ice tells us is that there were about 1.5 times more oxygen maybe than we have today. But the CO2 levels, it was 4 to 8 times as much. So that's probably a reason why these big animals could live on planet Earth, because the higher levels of CO2. And this, I think, is quite interesting. So since 1850, since the Industrial Revolution started, CO2 has increased by 280 ppm, that's parts per million. So in percentage, that is 0.028 to now around 430. And here you see the last 800,000 years, it has been quite stable, not going above 300, but now we see a really big increase. And whether that is man-made or not, that is a different topic. I'm not going into that. But anyway, it is increasing, and we just have to adapt to that. If we can't adapt to increasing levels of CO2, in my view, then we are doomed to a lifelong stress, because CO2 drives our breathing. It's not oxygen that makes us take the next breath. It's not the lack of oxygen in our body. It's the buildup of CO2. So CO2 controls our breath in our brainstem. And if we have low tolerance for CO2, that translates to the stressful fight-flight breathing. And if we learn to tolerate higher levels of CO2 and learn to adapt, which is one of the biggest trait of the human race, and the reason why we've been able to populate the whole planet like crazy, living from where it's very cold to where it's very hot, our ability to adapt. So now we're facing a new challenge where one part of us is seeking higher levels of CO2 and another part is not able to adapt to it. But when you look at this curve and you look at the population increase, it looks pretty much the same. I'm not saying that this is the only reason, but it's just interesting to put them together like this. The population has increased from 1 billion 200 years ago to now 8.2 billion. So we do naturally seek higher levels of CO2. We may not be aware of it, but if we think about, we already discussed about exercise. Many people like to exercise, and a reason for that is probably because we increase the production of CO2. During the pandemic, most of us wore face masks. Some of the CO2 will be trapped in the mask, and you will basically then go around like doing bag breathing, which is common if we have a panic attack, which will be the ultimate stress, right? If you have a panic attack and come to the hospital, you will get a bag to breathe in and out through. Or if you're out flying, the flight attendant will give you a bag to breathe in and out through if you're super stressed and worried and afraid of going on board the plane. We're digging up the oil and gas. The production of CO2 has increased since 1850 crazy a lot. We have more and more insulated homes, and we spend 90% of our time or even more indoors. So I have this little CO2 meter with me wherever I go, checking on in my homes or in a restaurant or in the car, or just to be aware. And whenever we spend time with other people, so when we move to cities, or when we sit in a facility like this, or when we work in crowded places, we increase the levels of CO2. So if normal atmosphere is 430 ppm, in this room there may be now 800 or 1,000. I forgot to bring it, of course. And when we're driving, commuting and flying, we also expose ourselves to higher levels of CO2. So on some level it seems like we are just like these animals I showed earlier, who have developed different traits that have helped them to live very long lives, where they live in an environment which is high in CO2. It seems like somehow unconsciously we are doing the same. But it's good then to be aware that we are doing it, so that we can use it to our advantage, because if not, we will end up with this stress breathing, which will then put us in fight flight, and we will not be able to live a fulfilled life. So some benefits when you look at the science. This is to improve the skin. They injected CO2 with a syringe. Here they injected in the head. Obviously I have not tried that. I think it was after 3 months, and I think...
Thank you.
After 3 months, and I think it was 5 injections or so. CO2 is the main regulator of blood flow to the brain, which we discussed on the earlier slide, used in brain surgery. So in this study, they inhaled 5% CO2 and noticed that the blood flow to the brain increased by 54%. And even more interesting, although there was more blood and more oxygen coming to the brain did not increase the oxygen consumption. Instead, it reduced the oxygen by 13%. So if we look at our society today, and we see that a lot of people are too stressed out, we are overthinking, probably that is because we get too much oxygen to the brain. So we need to restore that balance. And CO2 is a really beneficial way to do that. Here is another example.
Something with this slide. We have to go to the next slide. We had it yesterday as well.
Okay, so this slide, oh, now it works. No. So now is the time to breathe calmly, right? Close your mouth, prolong your exhale. That's the easiest way to calm your nervous system with your breathing. CO2 can improve mitochondria function. Here we see how it increases the formation of blood vessels and the size of the mitochondria, where we produce all our energy, or almost all our energy. So this is the mitochondrial DNA. It increased by about 80% in these muscles that were living in an environment higher in CO2. And they concluded in the study that the changes we saw here, they are very similar to doing aerobic exercise. So if we can maintain higher levels of CO2 in our body, if we can learn to tolerate higher levels, we will gain the same benefits as people that are exercising a lot. I'm not saying we should sit still and just breathe, but it tells that it's positive. And if we like to exercise, we can get out more of our exercise. So in this study, they injected tumor cells into mice, and they noticed that it had CO2, again, had a very big impact on the mitochondria. So here you have the expression of PGC1 alpha, which is a very important marker for mitochondrial biogenesis. If you have high PGC1 alpha, then you have a lot of mitochondria. They are bigger and they are more frequent. If you have low PGC1 alpha, then you have smaller mitochondria and they are less frequent. So you see it's almost a tenfold increase compared to the control group. And here you can see in the cancer cells, they were 48% smaller in the CO2 group. And the interesting thing is that they only got treated with CO2 twice per week for 20 minutes each time. So in total, during 2 weeks. So in total, 80, thank you so much. 80 minutes, that is 1.5 hours in 2 weeks, not a lot. As I mentioned earlier, CO2 is linked to pain. Here in this study, they measured the pain score. So they saw before in the study, their end tidal, the CO2 they were exhaling, was at 31 millimeter mercury. In medical textbook, it's said that about 40 millimeter of mercury is the normal, what we should aim for. So they had 31, so it was very little. And when they did some breathing retraining during 1 month, Buteyko breathing retraining, it increased to 37, and the pain was cut in half. Lactic acid is also associated with pain. So in this study, they took swimmers and they put one group in fresh water and another group in CO2 bath. They did it for 20 minutes. And then they had some rest and they measured the lactic acid. And you see that the freshwater lactic acid increased 50% more than the CO2 group. And it got quickly down. Then after 2 hours, it was the same, but a lot less and quickly recovering. Wound healing. In this Japanese study, they... So in this study, they checked, here is a case 1, a female coming into the hospital in wheelchair, scheduled for amputation. She did CO2 baths, and she could leave almost like normal. What CO2 does is it restores circulation. Another example from the same study, and this is sorry, I'm running out of time, so I'm going a little fast. This is a German doctor. He had his client trying a hand bath. He made his own carbonated water. You can go to the supermarket and purchase mineral water, or you can use sodium bicarbonate and citric acid. So he did it for up to an hour per day. Here it looks like a baby's bottom. It's, as the doctor said, I'm speechless. And here we see how the inflammation is reduced. The muscles, they were 2.5 times larger in the group where they put the muscles in CO2 compared to the control group. And also they noticed on the inflammation marker, interleukin, they were significantly lower in the CO2 group. Broken bones can be helped when you expose it to CO2. In this study, they broke the bones of the poor rats, and when they got no treatment, 20% was healed after 3 weeks, while 90% in the CO2 group. And again, it's not much. 20 minutes per day, 5 days per week. Lymph flow. They restored the lymph flow. Here you see, I'm not sure what measurement they were using, but there is a huge difference after 10 treatments. And we have a booth where you can try our products. We have one to inhale extra CO2, and then we have a suit you can put on to expose your body to 100% CO2. You're more than welcome to come and try them. And I think now we have room for some questions, or?
Well, we can try hard, because, well, I'm not sure if Mr. Schädel, who's the next one, to give us the information. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is, if you're talking about this, a saying from Neil Young is coming immediately to me. So he said the thing that is keeping alive will kill us at the end. And this is maybe this is meant for oxygen, it is for CO2. But what I've learned is I'm very happy that I'm living on 820 meters sea level. Yes, so
wonderful.
Wolfgang.